The cold steel of the handcuffs clicked shut, echoing sharply over the sound of the pouring rain. Officer Bradley Jenkins smirked, utterly convinced he had just taken down a brazen, high-profile car thief. He had no idea the laminated card he had just tossed into the wet gravel was a Level 1 United Nations diplomatic passport. In less than 12 hours, this aggressive traffic stop would trigger a massive international crisis, summon furious federal agents, and end a career in the most publicly humiliating way imaginable. The rain was coming down in sheets along the quiet, affluent stretches of the Merritt Parkway. Ambassador David Carmichael adjusted the climate control in his pristine black 2025 Mercedes-Benz S-Class, the faint hum of classical music playing softly through the speakers. At 52, David was a man who commanded respect effortlessly. With silver touching the temples of his close-cropped hair, an Oxford education, and a tailored charcoal Brioni suit that cost more than most people made in a month, he was the picture of international authority. As the senior UN ambassador for his delegation, his days were spent navigating complex geopolitical minefields. Tonight, however, he just wanted to get to his residence in Westchester. In the rearview mirror, a sudden burst of red and blue lights shattered the darkness. David sighed, his broad shoulders dropping slightly. He glanced at his speedometer. He was going exactly 55 miles per hour. He hadn't swerved. His taillights were functioning perfectly. He signaled calmly, smoothly, guiding the heavy luxury sedan onto the wet shoulder of the highway, shifting the gear into park and turning on the interior dome light. He lowered his window exactly 3 inches, standard protocol for a high-ranking official during a law enforcement encounter, and placed both hands at 10 and 2 on the leather steering wheel. Behind him, the police cruiser's doors opened. Out stepped Officer Bradley Jenkins. Jenkins was a man driven by ego, fueled by a dangerous cocktail of prejudice, and a badge. A 10-year veteran of the force, he had a reputation in the precinct for being overly aggressive, a trait his union rep had spent years covering up. Beside him was his rookie partner, Officer Timothy Fowler, a young man barely a year out of the academy who still believed in the rule book. As Jenkins approached the vehicle, his flashlight beam aggressively sliced through the rain, deliberately blinding the driver. He didn't bother to look at the car's license plate. If he had, he would have seen the distinct red, white, and blue design issued by the U.S. Department of State, clearly bearing the D prefix, signifying full diplomatic immunity. Instead, Jenkins only saw what his biases allowed him to see: a black man in an extraordinarily expensive car, in a wealthy, predominantly white neighborhood at midnight, license registration and proof of insurance. "No," Jenkins barked, tapping his heavy maglite against the reinforced glass of the Mercedes, leaving a faint scuff mark. "Good evening, officer," David replied, his voice a deep, resonant baritone, entirely devoid of panic. He didn't flinch at the tap on the glass. "I am reaching into my inside breast pocket to retrieve my identification. Is that acceptable?" Jenkins scoffed, resting his hand casually on the butt of his service weapon. "Just make it quick, pal, and no sudden movements." David reached into his suit jacket and withdrew a small leather-bound folio. He extracted a heavy, distinctively patterned identification card. It was not a state driver's license. It was a diplomatic identification card issued directly by the United States Department of State, granting the bearer absolute immunity from arrest, detention, and prosecution under the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations. He slipped the card through the crack in the window. "I am Ambassador David Carmichael. I am a senior diplomat attached to the United Nations. You will find my immunity status clearly printed on the back." Jenkins snatched the card. He shone his blinding flashlight onto it, squinting through the rain. He looked at the gold seal, the holographic overlay, and the title, Ambassador. Then he looked down at David. A cruel, disbelieving smirk spread across the officer's face. An ambassador. Jenkins laughed, a harsh, grating sound over the highway traffic. He looked back at his rookie partner. "Hey, Fowler, get a load of this guy, says he's a UN ambassador." Fowler stepped forward, nervously, rain dripping from his cap. "Sir, if it's a State Department ID..." "It's a fake, Tim." Jenkins interrupted loudly, his tone dripping with condescension. He looked back at David, his eyes hard and hostile. "You expect me to believe a guy like you is rolling around in a 200 grand car with diplomatic immunity? Where do you steal the car? Ambassador? Or is this a rental you're joyriding?" David's expression remained entirely neutral, though his eyes narrowed imperceptibly. He had dealt with warlords, dictators, and hostile foreign intelligence officers. A bigoted traffic cop was beneath his station, but infinitely more tedious. "Officer David," said his voice, dropping an octave, carrying the weight of a man used to giving orders. "I strongly advise you to run the plates on this vehicle. They are registered with the Office of Foreign Missions. If you confiscate that card, you are in violation of federal law. Return my identification and allow me to proceed." "Oh, you're giving me orders now," Jenkins sneered. He flicked his wrist, tossing the diplomatic ID onto the wet gravel shoulder. "Turn the car off. Step out of the vehicle. Officer Jenkins." Fowler started taking a step forward. "Maybe we should just run the plates. It has a D on it. Those are federal plates." "Shut up, Fowler. I know a stolen ride and a fake ID when I see one," Jenkins snapped. He drew his baton, tapping it against his palm. "I said step out of the car right now." The atmosphere shifted from a tense traffic stop to a highly volatile situation. David looked at his ID sitting in the mud. He understood exactly what was happening. This was not a misunderstanding. It was an exercise in power and racial profiling, plain and simple. "I am officially informing you," David said, clearly ensuring the officer's body camera captured every word, "that I am invoking my diplomatic immunity under Article 29 of the Vienna Convention. I cannot be arrested or detained. If you lay hands on me, you will be creating a federal incident." "Article 29, ha!" Jenkins mocked. "Get out of the car before I drag you out through the window," knowing that resisting a volatile armed officer on a dark highway was a death sentence, regardless of diplomatic status. David complied. He calmly unbuckled his seatbelt, pushed the door open, and stepped out into the pouring rain. He stood at his full height, 6'2", towering slightly over Jenkins. He made no aggressive moves, simply buttoning his suit jacket with an effortless dignity that seemed to infuriate Jenkins even more. "Turn around. Hands on the roof of the car," Jenkins ordered. David turned, placing his hands flat against the wet roof of the Mercedes. Jenkins kicked David's legs apart, roughly nearly making the ambassador slip on the wet asphalt. The officer patted him down with unnecessary force, finding nothing but a sleek smartphone and a Montblanc pen. "Nothing on him," Jenkins muttered, sounding almost disappointed. He grabbed David's wrists, yanking them behind his back with enough force to strain the rotator cuffs. "You are making a profound, career-ending mistake," David stated evenly, as the cold metal of the handcuffs bit into his wrists. The ratchets clicked tightly, cutting off the circulation to his hands. "Save it for the judge, buddy," Jenkins replied, thoroughly enjoying himself. "You're under arrest for grand theft, auto forgery, and providing false identification to a police officer. Let's see how that immunity works for you in county lockup." Fowler watched visibly pale rain washing over his horrified face. He walked over to the mud and carefully picked up the discarded diplomatic ID, wiping the grime off with his thumb. The holographic State Department seal caught the flashing lights of the cruiser. It felt thick. It felt real. "Jenkins," Fowler whispered, looking at the card. This looks really legitimate. The microprinting is perfect. We need to call a supervisor to the scene. I am the senior officer here." Jenkins roared, shoving David toward the back of the cruiser. "Stop being a coward, Fowler. Open the door." Fowler hesitated, then reluctantly opened the back door of the patrol car. Jenkins roughly guided David's head down, shoving him into the hard plastic back seat. The smell of stale sweat and cheap disinfectant hit David's nose. He sat in the darkness, the rain drumming against the roof of the car. His expensive suit ruined his hands, numb. Yet he did not shout. He did not curse. He simply sat in absolute, terrifying silence. It was the silence of a man who didn't need to fight back with his fists, because he knew he possessed the power to destroy the officer's life with a single phone call. Jenkins climbed into the driver's seat, wiping the rain from his face, grinning from ear to ear. "Got ourselves a big fish tonight, Timmy. This guy's going away for a long time." Fowler climbed into the passenger seat, clutching the diplomatic ID. "What about the Mercedes? Call a tow. Tell them to impound it," Jenkins ordered, pulling the cruiser back onto the highway. "You can't tow a vehicle with diplomatic plates." "Officer Warhol." David's voice drifted calmly from the back seat. "It is sovereign territory. If a tow truck driver hooks that car, he and your department will be liable for millions in damages." "Shut up back there!" Jenkins snapped, hitting the divider glass. Fowler swallowed hard, pulling out his radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 4, requesting a tow at our location. But, dispatch, run the plate for me before you call the yard. David, Delta 729. "Fowler, you idiot. I told you it's fake," Jenkins complained. David leaned his head back against the hard plastic, closing his eyes. Let them dig their own grave, he thought. Let them dig it as deep as they possibly can. The drive to the 42nd Precinct took 20 minutes. When they pulled into the Sally Port, Jenkins dragged David out of the car with the same rough arrogance. They walked through the heavy steel doors into the brightly lit, chaotic booking area. Suspects were chained to benches, phones were ringing, and the smell of bad coffee permeated the air. At the elevated front desk sat Sergeant Winston Harrison, a 25-year veteran who was 2 years away from a pension he desperately wanted to enjoy. He was currently dealing with a pile of paperwork and looked up with a scowl as Jenkins paraded his prisoner into the room. "Look what I dragged in, Sarge," Jenkins announced, proudly shoving David toward the booking counter. "Caught him on the merit, driving a stolen S-Class, holding fake federal IDs." Sergeant Harrison looked down at David. He took in the ruined Brioni suit, the posture, the intense, intelligent eyes, and the absolute lack of fear. Harrison had been a cop a long time. He knew what criminals looked like. He knew what panic looked like. The man standing before him looked like a CEO who was about to fire the entire board of directors. "Fake IDs?" Harrison asked, his voice cautious. Fowler scurried up to the desk, looking like he was about to throw up. He silently slid the wiped-off diplomatic card across the elevated desk toward the sergeant. Harrison picked it up. He adjusted his reading glasses. He looked at the gold seal. He rubbed his thumb over the security threading. Then he read the name. Ambassador David Carmichael. Harrison's stomach performed a sudden, violent drop. "Jenkins," he said slowly, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Did you run this guy's name? Did you run the plates on the car?" "Didn't have to, Sarge. It's obviously a forgery," Jenkins said dismissively, leaning against the counter. "I mean, look at him. You think a guy like that is a UN ambassador?" The sheer, unapologetic racism in the statement hung in the air. David finally spoke, his voice carrying clearly across the quieted booking room. "Sergeant, as I informed your officer on the highway, I am Ambassador David Carmichael. I possess Level 1 diplomatic immunity. I have been unlawfully detained, assaulted, and falsely arrested. My vehicle, which is registered sovereign property, has been abandoned on the highway. I demand that you remove these handcuffs immediately, and I want my phone." Jenkins scoffed. "Don't listen to his bull, Sarge. Throw him in holding." Sergeant Harrison ignored Jenkins. He turned to his computer terminal and rapidly typed in the ID number from the card into the federal database. The system paused for a second. Then the screen flashed with a bright, unmistakable red banner. Warning. Department of State. Critical alert. Full immunity. Subject David Carmichael. Senior Ambassador, United Nations. Do not detain. Do not arrest. Contact. U.S. Dept of State. Immediately. Harrison stopped breathing. He stared at the screen, the reflection of the red banner glowing in his glasses. His eyes slowly moved from the monitor to Jenkins, who was still grinning oblivious to the nuclear bomb he had just dropped on the precinct. "Jenkins." Harrison's voice trembled. "Where is his car?" "Waiting for the tow," Jenkins said. "Call it off," Harrison barked, suddenly leaping out of his chair. "Call the damn tow truck off right now." "Sarge, what's the big deal?" "The big deal, you absolute moron, is that you just arrested a sitting United Nations ambassador." Harrison roared, his voice echoing off the cinder-block walls. Every cop and criminal in the room froze. "Get those cuffs off him. Now." Jenkins blinked, his smug expression finally faltering. "Sarge, it's a fake." "It is real." Harrison slammed his fist on the desk. "He's flagged by the State Department. You violated federal law." Just then, the door to the precinct captain's office swung open. Captain Robert Stanfield, a hard-nosed commander with a zero-tolerance policy for incompetence, stormed out, holding a ringing desk phone in his hand. He looked frantic. "Harrison," Captain Stanfield yelled. "I just got a call from the director of the FBI's New York field office. The State Department just notified them that a distress beacon was activated in a diplomatic vehicle registered to an Ambassador Carmichael." David smiled softly. The Mercedes had an automatic tamper alert that triggered the moment a tow truck tried to move it without the key fob present. Stanfield's eyes scanned the room, landing on the tall, impeccably dressed black man, handcuffed at the booking desk, surrounded by his officers. The blood drained from the captain's face so fast, he looked like a ghost. "Oh my God," Stanfield breathed. He dropped the phone. It dangled by its cord, the voice of an angry federal agent, still buzzing from the receiver. Stanfield sprinted down the stairs. "Who did this? Who cuffed him?" Jenkins took a step back, the reality of the situation finally piercing his thick skull. Captain I. He matched the description of a— "Shut your mouth," Stanfield bellowed. He shoved Jenkins aside and pulled a set of keys from his belt, stepping behind David. His hands were shaking as he fumbled with the locks. "Ambassador Carmichael Phi, I cannot express how deeply sorry I am for this catastrophic error." The cuffs clicked open. David rubbed his bruised wrists, slowly bringing his hands to the front. He adjusted his cuffs, his eyes completely devoid of mercy, as he looked at the terrified precinct captain, and then at Jenkins, who was now sweating profusely. "Save your apologies, Captain," David said, his voice cold as ice. "Your officer didn't make an error. He made a choice. And now I am going to make mine. I want my phone. I am calling the Secretary of State." Captain Robert Stanfield's office was not designed to host international dignitaries. It was a cramped, utilitarian space, smelling faintly of stale cigar smoke and floor wax, with walls adorned by faded commendations and local sports memorabilia. Tonight, however, it served as the improvised command center for an escalating geopolitical nightmare. Ambassador David Carmichael sat behind the captain's own heavy oak desk, having silently claimed the seat of authority the moment he walked into the room. His ruined Brioni suit jacket was draped over the back of the chair. He held his sleek, encrypted smartphone to his ear, his voice low, steady, and terrifyingly calm. Outside the frosted glass of the office door, the precinct was in a state of absolute paralyzed panic. Officer Bradley Jenkins stood near the water cooler, aggressively pacing. His earlier swagger had evaporated, replaced by the jittery, nervous energy of a man slowly realizing he had stepped on a landmine. He was whispering frantically into his own phone, talking to Michael Carisi, the most aggressive representative the local police union had to offer. "Mike, you gotta get down here," Jenkins hissed, keeping his voice down so Sergeant Harrison wouldn't hear. "They're blowing this out of proportion." The guy was completely uncooperative. It was dark. It was raining. The ID looked fake. I had reasonable suspicion. Across the room, Officer Timothy Fowler sat at an empty desk, his head in his hands. He felt sick to his stomach. He had tried to stop it. He had warned Jenkins. But he also knew that internal affairs didn't care about warnings. They cared about who was on the scene when a federal law was broken. Back inside the office, David finished his call. He placed the phone gently on the desk. He had bypassed local channels entirely, directly contacting the United States Department of State Operations Center, followed by a brief, highly classified conversation with the Undersecretary for Management. The wheels of the federal government, usually slow and bureaucratic, move with terrifying velocity when an international treaty is blatantly violated on American soil. Captain Stanfield stood awkwardly by the door, shifting his weight. "Mr. Ambassador, I have ordered hot coffee, and we have a dry shirt in the locker room if you—" Captain David interrupted, his tone polite, but entirely devoid of warmth. "Do not attempt to placate me with coffee. At this exact moment, a team from the Office of Foreign Missions is en route to secure my vehicle on the Merritt Parkway. Concurrently, the Federal Bureau of Investigation is dispatching a task force to this precinct." Stanfield swallowed hard. "The FBI, sir, is that really necessary? We can handle this internally. Officer Jenkins will be heavily disciplined." "Disciplined," David repeated, a dangerous edge creeping into his voice. "Your officer committed felony assault, unlawful detainment, and violated the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, Title 18, United States Code, Section 112. This is not a matter for a precinct disciplinary board, Captain. This is a federal crime scene." Before Stanfield could formulate a response, the heavy double doors of the precinct's front entrance violently banged open. The chaotic murmur of the booking room vanished, replaced by the heavy, synchronized thud of tactical boots. 6 men and women wearing dark suits and windbreakers, emblazoned with the bright yellow letters FBI, strode into the room. They moved with absolute, uncompromising authority, parting the sea of local cops like Moses at the Red Sea. Leading the pack was Special Agent in Charge, SAC, Jonathan Pierce, a tall, severe-looking man with salt-and-pepper hair and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. Pierce bypassed the front desk, entirely marching straight into the bullpen. "Who is the commanding officer of this facility, SAC?" Pierce's voice boomed, cutting through the silence. Stanfield practically fell out of his own office. "I am Captain Stanfield." Pierce flashed his gold shield. "Special Agent Pierce, New York Field Office. As of this exact second, the FBI is assuming full jurisdictional control over this precinct. Nobody leaves. Nobody makes a phone call. Nobody touches a computer terminal." Jenkins, standing by the water cooler, suddenly looked very small. He took a step backward, bumping into a filing cabinet. Pierce turned to his team. "Agent Collins, secure the evidence locker. Agent Davis, I want the server room locked down. Pull all body camera footage, dash camera footage, and internal CCTV from the last 2 hours. If a single byte of data is missing or corrupted, I will personally arrest the shift commander for obstruction of justice." Sergeant Harrison stood up slowly behind the desk. Agents, the body cams are already docked. We haven't touched them. Good, Pierce said sharply. He then turned his attention to the captain's office. He straightened his tie, his entire demeanor shifting from aggressive federal investigator to respectful government liaison. He walked to the door, knocked gently on the open frame, and stepped inside. Ambassador Carmichael, Pierce said, extending a hand. Special Agent Jonathan Pierce. I have been sent by the Director at the explicit request of the Secretary of State. Are you injured, sir? David stood and shook the agent's hand. Bruised wrists, Agent Pierce. Nothing permanent. But my patience is entirely exhausted. Understood, sir, Pierce replied smoothly. Your vehicle has been secured by State Department personnel and is being transported to your residence. A federal driver is waiting outside to take you home whenever you are ready. We have the situation here completely contained. I am not leaving yet, David said, stepping out from behind the desk. He walked into the bullpen. The room was dead silent. Every local officer was frozen, watching the UN diplomat, who had just summoned the wrath of the federal government, down upon their heads. David's eyes scanned the room until they locked onto Officer Jenkins. Jenkins tried to hold the gaze, trying to project the tough cop persona he had relied on for a decade, but under the crushing weight of federal scrutiny and David's unyielding stare, he looked away. Agent Pierce, David said, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the room. That is the man who assaulted me. He ignored my federally issued credentials, mocked my position, and detained me without cause. Pierce turned his severe gaze upon Jenkins. Name and badge number? Officer Bradley Jenkins. He mumbled, his throat dry. Badge 8842. Officer Jenkins. Pierce said, his tone chillingly bureaucratic. You are hereby ordered to surrender your service weapon, your taser, and your radio. You are being stripped of your police powers, pending a joint federal and internal investigation into civil rights violations and the unlawful detention of a foreign diplomat. You can't do that, Jenkins suddenly shouted, panic finally overriding his common sense. I'm Union. You can't just strip my powers without my rep present. He was driving a suspicious vehicle. I had the right to investigate. You had the right to run the federally registered diplomatic license plate, Pierce countered, stepping into Jenkins' personal space. A plate that was prominently displayed. Instead, you chose to escalate. Hand over your weapon. Now, Jenkins's hands shook violently as he unclipped his gun belt, placing it on the nearest desk. The heavy thud of the loaded Glock hitting the wood sounded like a gavel falling. Mr. Ambassador, Pierce said, turning back to David. We will need a formal statement, but we can do that tomorrow at your convenience at a location of your choosing. Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. David stated, adjusting his cuffs. But I will not be doing it at my residence. I will be doing it at City Hall, and I expect the mayor and the police commissioner to be present. David walked slowly toward the exit. As he passed Officer Fowler, who was still trembling at his desk, David paused. He looked down at the young rookie. You knew it was wrong, David said, quietly, meant only for Fowler. You held the truth in your hands, and you chose to follow a bully instead of the law. Remember how this feels, officer, because the badge does not grant you immunity from the truth. David walked out into the rain, leaving a shattered precinct in his wake. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving the city washed clean and bathed in bright, unforgiving sunlight. The atmosphere inside the mayor's executive conference room, however, was suffocatingly dark. Word had leaked. It was impossible to keep a lid on an FBI raid of a local precinct, especially when it involved a high-profile United Nations diplomat. The early morning news cycles were already running speculative chyrons. Local police detain UN Ambassador, international incident brewing. Mayor Richard Bowman, a politician whose primary skill was avoiding controversy, sat at the head of the massive mahogany table, rubbing his temples furiously. To his right was Police Commissioner Theodore Rossi, looking grim and exhausted. To his left sat Michael Carisi, the aggressive union representative who was shuffling through a stack of legal pads looking ready for a brawl. At exactly 9 a.m., the heavy double doors opened. Ambassador David Carmichael entered. The ruined Brioni suit from the night before was gone, replaced by a flawless navy blue Tom Ford suit, a crisp white shirt, and a subtle patterned silk tie. He moved with the effortless grace of a predator, entering a cage full of cornered prey. Flanking him was a sharp-suited woman, holding a thick leather briefcase. Eleanor Vance, no, let's use a different name, to adhere to constraints, Sarah Morrison, the senior legal attaché for the UN delegation. Following them was FBI Special Agent Pierce. The power dynamic in the room was immediately established. David did not wait to be offered a seat. He took the chair directly opposite the mayor, while Sarah and Agent Pierce flanked him. Mr. Ambassador, shh. Mayor Bowman started his voice, dripping with practiced political contrition. Let me begin by offering the profound and unreserved apologies of this city. What happened last night was a tragic misunderstanding, an anomaly that does not reflect the values of our police department. Save the campaign speech, Mayor Bowman. David interrupted smoothly, his voice devoid of anger, but heavy with absolute authority. We are not here to exchange pleasantries. We are here to discuss consequences. Commissioner Rossi leaned forward, lacing his fingers together. Ambassador Carmichael, I assure you Internal Affairs is already fast-tracking this. Officer Jenkins has been suspended, with pay pending a full review. Suspended with pay, David repeated, raising an eyebrow. A paid vacation for violating federal law and international treaties. How utterly predictable, Michael Carisi. The union rep slammed his hand flat on the table. With all due respect, Ambassador, my officer was doing his job. He's patrolling a high-theft area in the middle of a torrential downpour. You were driving a high-value vehicle. The conditions were terrible. He made a judgment call regarding the validity of your ID. It was a mistake, yes, but it wasn't malicious. You cannot crucify a decorated cop for a good faith error. David looked at Carisi as if he were observing a fascinating, entirely insignificant insect. A good faith error, David murmured. He turned his head slightly. Ms. Morrison, please distribute the documents. Sarah Morrison opened her heavy leather briefcase. She extracted 3 thick bound folders and slid one to the mayor, one to the commissioner, and one directly in front of Carisi. What is this? Carisi demanded, refusing to open it. That Agent Pierce answered from the corner of the room is a federally declassified summary of Officer Bradley Jenkins's sealed internal affairs file, subpoenaed by the Department of Justice at 3 a.m. this morning. Commissioner Rossi opened the folder, his eyes scanning the first page. The color rapidly drained from his face. Let me summarize it for you, Mr. Carisi, since you seem hesitant to read your own client's history. David said, his voice ringing with chilling clarity. In the last 10 years, Officer Jenkins has been the subject of 14 excessive force complaints. 12 of those complaints were filed by Black or Hispanic motorists. He has cost this city over $2 million in quiet, out-of-court settlements. And yet, through union pressure and bureaucratic cowardice, he has remained on the street, armed and empowered. Those complaints were unsubstantiated. Carisi argued loudly, though a bead of sweat was forming on his forehead. You can't use sealed files to... I can and I will. David snapped his voice, finally rising, echoing off the wood-paneled walls. Because last night, his unsubstantiated bias became an international liability. You claim the conditions were dark, Mr. Carisi. You claim it was a good faith error. David nodded to Agent Pierce. Pierce pulled a small remote from his pocket and pointed it at the large television screen mounted on the wall. The screen flickered to life, showing the high-definition, unredacted dashcam footage from Jenkins' cruiser. The audio was crystal clear. The room watched in horrified silence as the video played. They saw the blinding flashlight. They heard David clearly state his name and diplomatic status. They saw Jenkins snatch the federal ID, refuse to look at it, and toss it into the mud. Then the audio from Jenkins's body camera played over the speakers, capturing his conversation with Officer Fowler. An ambassador. Get a load of this guy, says he's a UN ambassador. You expect me to believe a guy like you is rolling around in a $2,000 car with diplomatic immunity? Where'd you steal the car? The video cut to black. The silence in the conference room was absolute, heavy and suffocating. Mayor Bowman looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. Commissioner Rossi was staring at the blank screen, his jaw tight with fury, realizing the Union could not spin this. That is not a misunderstanding, David stated, breaking the silence. That is racial profiling arrogance and gross incompetence caught on federal video. And if you attempt to sweep this under the rug, Mayor, I will ensure that video is playing on a loop during the next United Nations General Assembly. I will hold a press conference at the UN Plaza, and I will detail exactly how your city treats international diplomats. Mayor Bowman swallowed dryly. What are your demands, Ambassador? I do not negotiate with municipalities, David said coldly. But I will give you a one-time offer to avoid a federal civil rights lawsuit that will bankrupt your police department. First Officer Jenkins doesn't get suspended. He gets fired. Today. Terminated for cause, stripping him of his pension and his ability to transfer to another precinct. We can't just fire him without due process, Carisi protested, though his voice lacked its previous venom. You will find a way, David replied, ignoring the union rep entirely and focusing on the commissioner. Second, the Department of Justice will be opening a pattern or practice investigation into this precinct. You will cooperate fully, or the FBI will dismantle your department brick by brick. David stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. He leaned over the table, planting his hands firmly on the polished wood, looking directly into Commissioner Rossi's eyes. I am a diplomat, Commissioner. My entire career is built on finding peaceful resolutions to complex conflicts, David said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. But make no mistake, I have full immunity. You do not. By the end of this business day, I expect to see Officer Jenkins's badge sitting on this table. If I do not, I promise you, the ensuing federal storm will end your career alongside his. David turned on his heel and walked toward the door, Sarah Morrison right behind him. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He had dropped the match, and now he was simply leaving them to deal with the fire. The oppressive silence inside the offices of the Patrolmen's Benevolent Association felt heavier than the humidity choking the city outside. Officer Bradley Jenkins sat aggressively in a cracked leather chair, his leg bouncing with a nervous, frantic energy. He had spent the last 4 hours pacing this exact room, waiting for Michael Carisi to return from the mayor's office. Jenkins had convinced himself that this was just another bump in the road. He had been in trouble before. 14 complaints, internal affairs investigations. They always went away. The union always protected him. The heavy wooden door clicked open, and Carisi walked in. The union representative looked 10 years older than he had that morning. He didn't look at Jenkins. He walked straight to the small minibar in the corner of the office, poured 2 fingers of cheap bourbon into a plastic cup and swallowed it in one go. Well, Jenkins demanded, standing up, his voice cracking slightly. What did the mayor say? 2 weeks unpaid desk duty for a month. Come on, Mike. Tell me we beat this guy. Carisi slowly crushed the plastic cup in his fist and tossed it into the trash. He finally turned to look at Jenkins. There was no sympathy in his eyes, only the exhausted, cold calculation of a man cutting his losses. "You're done, Brad," Carisi said softly. Jenkins froze. The color drained from his face, replaced rapidly by a flushed, angry red. "What the hell does that mean, I'm done? You're supposed to protect me. That's what I pay union dues for. I can protect you from a pissed-off sergeant." Carisi snapped his voice, suddenly rising to a shout. "I can protect you from an overzealous civilian review board. Hell, I have protected you from 14 separate excessive force complaints that should have had you fired 5 years ago. But I cannot protect you from the United States Department of State, the FBI, and the Department of Justice." Jenkins took a step back, his bravado shattering. "Mike, come on. It was a dark highway. The guy was completely arrogant. I made a mistake." "You didn't make a mistake, Brad. You made a profoundly stupid, arrogant choice on high-definition federal video." Carisi growled, walking over to his desk and slapping a thick stack of papers down. The ambassador gave the mayor an ultimatum. Either you are terminated for cause today, or the DOJ launches a pattern or practice investigation into the entire precinct, and he sues the city into bankruptcy. The mayor isn't going to let the federal government colonize his police department to save your miserable career. "They can't just fire me without a hearing," Jenkins shouted, desperation clawing at his throat. "I have rights." "Your rights ended the second you illegally detained a foreign diplomat with level 1 immunity." Carisi replied, his tone turning icy. "You violated the Vienna Convention. That is a federal crime. The FBI is literally waiting to see if the commissioner fires you. Because if he doesn't, Special Agent Pierce is going to walk into your living room tonight and arrest you for civil rights violations under Title 18. You are looking at federal prison, Brad." The word prison hit Jenkins like a physical blow. His knees buckled slightly, and he fell back into the cracked leather chair. He stared at the floor, his breathing shallow and rapid. "My pension," he whispered. "Gone," Carisi confirmed mercilessly. "Terminated for cause means you forfeit your pension. You are stripped of your law enforcement certification. You will never wear a badge in this state or any other state ever again. The commissioner is expecting you in his office in 20 minutes to formally surrender your shield. I suggest you walk in there, keep your mouth shut, and hand it over. If you fight this, they will let the feds eat you alive." 20 minutes later, the walk to Commissioner Theodore Rossi's office felt like a death march. As Jenkins moved through the corridors of police headquarters, the usual camaraderie was absent. Officers who had shared beers with him the week before suddenly found the floor tiles incredibly fascinating. The blue wall of silence had not just cracked. The federal government had driven a tank through it. Nobody was going down for a rogue cop who had brought this level of heat onto the department. Commissioner Rossi was standing behind his desk when Jenkins entered. Next to him stood Arthur Penhaligon, the chief of department, his face carved from granite. Neither man offered Jenkins a seat. "Officer Jenkins," Rossi began, his voice devoid of any emotion. It was the voice of an executioner reading a sentence. "Effective immediately, your employment with this department is terminated. You are being dismissed under charges of conduct, unbecoming, an officer, gross insubordination, unlawful detainment, and direct violation of department policy regarding diplomatic protocols." Jenkins stood rigid, his jaw clenched so tightly his teeth ached. He looked at Carisi, who was standing in the corner, staring at the floor. No help was coming. Furthermore, Chief Penhaligon added his voice, a low rumble. Internal Affairs is turning over all documentation regarding your previous 14 complaints to the Department of Justice. You are officially decertified. I gave 10 years to this city. Jenkins muttered, his voice trembling with a toxic mix of rage and terror. 10 years of dealing with the garbage on the streets, and you're throwing me to the wolves over one traffic stop. Rossi's eyes narrowed, flashing with sudden, barely contained fury. He leaned across the desk. You arrogant fool! You didn't give 10 years to this city. You spent 10 years using a badge to bully people you thought couldn't fight back. Well, last night you finally pulled over someone who could. And he broke you. Put the badge on the desk. Jenkins hesitated. His hand hovered over his chest where the silver shield usually sat. It was his entire identity. It was his power. Without it, he was just an unemployed, disgraced civilian facing a potential federal indictment. Do it, Jenkins, Chief Penhaligon barked. Or I will have the duty captain arrest you for trespassing. Slowly, with shaking fingers, Jenkins unclipped the leather shield holder from his belt. He stared at the silver metal, the engraved numbers 8842, blurring as tears of absolute humiliation filled his eyes. He placed it gently on the polished mahogany of the commissioner's desk. It made a dull, heavy sound. Your identification cards, your building access pass, and your transit card, Rossi demanded. Jenkins emptied his pockets, placing the plastic cards next to the badge. You are no longer a police officer, Rossi said, straightening his posture. You have 10 minutes to clean out your locker. A supervisor will escort you to the perimeter of the building. If you ever set foot on department property again, you will be arrested. Get out of my sight. Jenkins turned and walked out of the office. He was a ghost, stripped of his armor, stepping out into a world that suddenly felt incredibly hostile and completely out of his control. While Jenkins was suffering the total annihilation of his career, Officer Timothy Fowler was sitting in a sterile, windowless interview room at the FBI field office in Lower Manhattan. The young rookie had not slept. His uniform was rumpled, and a paper cup of cold coffee sat untouched in front of him. Across the metal table sat Special Agent Jonathan Pierce. A digital audio recorder was placed exactly in the center of the table, its red light blinking rhythmically. Officer Fowler, Pierce said, smoothly leaning back in his chair. I want to be perfectly clear about your position here. You are currently considered a witness, not a subject of a federal civil rights investigation. However, that status is entirely dependent on your complete and unvarnished honesty. Fowler swallowed dryly. He looked at the blinking red light. He knew what he was doing. Testifying against a senior officer, even a disgraced fired one, was the ultimate taboo in police culture. But Fowler also remembered the terrifying calm in Ambassador Carmichael's eyes. He remembered the feeling of holding that legitimate diplomatic ID in his hands and choosing to stay silent while his partner committed a felony. The badge does not grant you immunity from the truth. The ambassador's words echoed in his mind, sharp and unforgiving. I'll tell you everything. Fowler said, his voice quiet but surprisingly steady. I warned him. I told Officer Jenkins that the ID felt real, that the plates had a D prefix. I asked him to call a supervisor to the scene. And how did Officer Jenkins respond? Pierce asked, writing a quick note on a legal pad. He told me to shut up. Fowler recalled the shame washing over him again. He said he knew a stolen ride and a fake AD when he saw one. He didn't care about the protocols. He just saw a black man in a Mercedes and made up his mind. Pierce nodded slowly. Did he use excessive force? Yes, sir. He kicked the ambassador's legs out, shoved him against the vehicle and cuffed him overly tight. The ambassador wasn't resisting. He was perfectly calm. He even cited the Vienna Convention to us. Fowler looked down at his trembling hands. I should have stopped him. I should have physically intervened. You were a rookie on a dark highway, with an unstable, aggressive senior partner." Pierce said, his tone softening just a fraction. "You made a mistake by not acting Fowler, but you are making the right choice now. Your testimony is the final nail in the coffin for Jenkins, and it's going to help us clean house at the 42nd Precinct." Fowler looked up, confused. Clean house? Ambassador Carmichael's ultimatum wasn't just about Jenkins. Pierce explained, a slight grim smile touching his lips. Firing Jenkins stopped the ambassador from suing the city, but it didn't stop the Department of Justice from looking into the precinct. Your statement today gives us the probable cause we need to open the sealed files of 4 other officers in your command who share Jenkins's disciplinary patterns. The blue wall is coming down, kid. Fowler exhaled a long, shaky breath. He felt a strange mixture of terror and immense relief. He might be an outcast in the locker room, but for the first time since he put on the uniform, he felt like he was actually protecting and serving. Miles away, high above the chaotic streets of Manhattan, the air was cool and serene inside the United Nations headquarters. Ambassador David Carmichael sat in his expansive corner office, the floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic, uninterrupted view of the East River and the city skyline. He was back in his element. He wore a flawless, double-breasted grey suit, a fresh cup of Earl Grey tea steaming gently on his expansive glass desk. His bruised wrists still ached slightly, a lingering physical reminder of the gravel shoulder of the Merritt Parkway. But his mind was entirely focused on the future. The heavy oak door to his office opened quietly, and Sarah Morrison, his senior legal attaché, walked in. She carried a single slim manila folder. "Good afternoon, Ambassador." Sarah said, her tone professional, though a hint of satisfaction played at the corners of her mouth. "Good afternoon, Sarah," David replied, turning his chair away from the window to face her. "Do we have confirmation?" "We do," Sarah said, stepping forward and laying the folder on his desk. She opened it, revealing a single official document bearing the seal of the City Police Department. Signed by Commissioner Rossi at 1:45 p.m., Officer Bradley Jenkins has been officially terminated for cause. His pension is revoked, his state certification is cancelled, and his badge has been surrendered. David looked at the document. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply read the official language of a bully's downfall. Furthermore, Sarah continued, tapping a second piece of paper in the file. Special Agent Pierce sent a secure memo. The DOJ has officially launched a systemic review of the 42nd Precinct. Officer Fowler is cooperating fully. Several other officers with histories of racial profiling and excessive force are being benched pending federal interviews. David leaned back, steepling his fingers beneath his chin. A necessary purge. Power without accountability is a rot, Sarah. It spreads until you cut it out entirely. You certainly wielded your immunity like a scalpel, sir, Sarah noted, closing the folder. The mayor's office is terrified. They sent over a massive floral arrangement this morning. I had security scan it and send it to a local hospital. Good, David murmured. He stood up and walked back to the massive window, looking down at the tiny cars crawling along the FDR drive. He thought about Jenkins, a man who had felt so colossal, so terrifyingly powerful in the dark, pouring rain. In the light of day, against the vast, unrelenting machinery of international law, he was nothing. Immunity, David said softly, speaking almost to himself, is a shield meant to protect diplomacy from tyranny. It is not a weapon. But occasionally, when you are confronted by a tyrant, even a small, petty one wearing a tin badge, you must remind them that true power does not come from a gun. It comes from the law. He turned back to Sarah, his expression resolute. The matter was closed. The rot had been excised. Draft a brief message to the Secretary of State. David instructed, his voice returning to its normal commanding cadence. Inform him that the situation regarding my detainment has been resolved to my complete satisfaction. No further federal action on my behalf is required. Right away, Ambassador, Sarah said, turning toward the door. She paused, looking back over her shoulder. It's a good day for justices, sir. Justice is rarely swift, Sarah, David replied, taking a sip of his tea. But when it finally arrives, it should be absolute. He looked back out over the city. The rain had completely washed away the grime of the previous night, leaving the skyline sharp, clear, and unyielding. The ambassador went back to work his dignity. Intact, his authority absolute, and his world righted once more. If you felt the absolute justice in this story, make sure you hit that like button right now. Ambassador Carmichael proved that true power doesn't need to shout, and watching a corrupt bully face the ultimate consequences is a satisfaction we all crave. We bring you the most intense, gripping, and dramatic real-life inspired stories on the internet, and you do